The world #1 tennis player Novak Djokovic has been denied entry to Australia less than 2 weeks before the start of the Australian Open tennis tournament. Djokovic had his visa revoked after being held at Melbourne airport for several hours. Before he left for Australia, he said he'd been granted a medical exemption to take part in the Grand Slam without being vaccinated against COVID-19. Djokovic says he will file a court injunction to stop his deportation. A short while ago, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison had this to say about the tennis star.
On the issue of Mr Djokovic, rules are rules, and there are no special cases. Entry with a visa requires double vaccination or a medical exemption. I'm advised that such an exemption was not in place, and as a result, he is subject to the same rule as anyone else.
Now, to talk us through this story, I'm joined by tennis commentator Steve Pearce in Melbourne. Good to see you again, Steve. After apparently being granted an exemption from vaccination, from the vaccination requirement, Djokovic has now had his visa revoked. What happened?
That's a good question again. It's something that people are trying to piece together now. In Melbourne, it's what everyone's talking about. So basically what it seems is, although the Victorian state government and its process with Tennis Australia involving medical expertise to decide whether to permit him to play in the tournament or not, that medical exemption was approved for Novak Djokovic. Then he's very publicly declared that and jumped on a flight, which possibly now looking back wasn't the best thing to do, could have come in a bit more low key. Anyway, he's jumped on a flight and arrived at Melbourne airport late last night, Australia time. It's 10 o'clock in the morning now here in Melbourne. And the Border Force, which is run by the federal government, who look after the actual borders of Australia rather than Victoria, the Australian Open, have looked at his visa and looked at the supporting evidence with that around the medical exemption and have decided that that is not sufficient to gain entry to Australia. And they have contacted the state government last night and asked whether the state government would do anything further to support Novak Djokovic's entry into Australia. The state government has said, no, we can't do anything further to support it. This is how it is. And therefore, the Australian Border Force has made the decision to cancel his visa and is aiming to deport him today back to Serbia. But there is more to play out potentially in the courts.
I mean, there's been a lot of negative reaction and a lot of strong feelings in Australia since we talked 24 hours ago. What are people saying now? What's the reaction now to this latest news?
They're pretty much flabbergasted. Everyone who didn't want him to come anyway is just saying, well, that's great, turn him around, get him out of here. But I think overall the sense is just that, how could it come to this? How could it be that the two processes that should be far more aligned and far smoother? I mean, you've got a situation where you have state governments here in Australia, and I know this is the case in some other countries around the world, but state governments who are responsible for A, B and C, and then federal governments responsible for D, E and F, and the two just not meeting, not talking, not understanding the process. But there's that, and so how did it come to that? But also from Novak Djokovic's position and his team, how could it be that these visa requirements were not ticked off so robustly before he took that photograph and announced that he was on his way to Australia? I mean, everyone knows that getting into a country with the right visa requirements is absolutely the first thing you have to deal with. So the reaction really here is just everyone throwing their hands up in the air, really, and everyone's blaming each other. The Victorian government's blaming the federal government, vice versa. It's a mess, and it's actually quite embarrassing for the country, I think, as well. It's one thing to be firm and the rules apply to everyone, but don't let it come to this. Surely this could have been sorted out before he actually got on a flight.
All right, tennis commentator for Australian Open Radio, Steve Pearce, thank you for your insights.
Thanks, Ola.